So continuing with what we see, so we will just first take into account how Ibn Sina and maybe other the logicians, how they included, how they studied mantiq. But before doing that, we first have how the epistemology of it, or larger logic and metaphysics, how it was broadly seen, the epistemology of it. In that context, Farabi's Kitab al-Burhan is always quoted without abbreviation to avoid confusion with al-Burhan of Ibn Sina. So the central point of Ibn Sina is, in that sense, is that the condition under which an assertion, the way we said, tasdeeq, judgment, had these terminologies. So in that context, an assertion may be characterized as certain and therefore taken to be expressed as scientific truth. So how do we construe the certainty of statements or scientific statements in that sense? And the conditions under which a complex term may be characterized as adequate conceptual representations of the essence of the object. So in the labyrinth of those conceptual categorizations, how we can see essence of things. So in that sense, maybe Ibn Sina used the same Greek and Latin counterparts in terms of epistemic characterization. The only point is that somehow where Ibn Sina differed from Aristotle is the way he uses the words of how he sees causality in some fundamental sense. In the way Aristotle saw causality in terms of formal, efficient, final, the causes, or ilah, which you see illat in that sense. And his so here the infinite regress and circularity. So the infinite regress which takes place so the fact that all scientific knowledge is demonstrative, it can lead to infinite regress in that sense. So here the notion that the assertion, belief, and deduction, which is one of the pillars of Ibn Sina's, how he takes the scientific reasoning into account. Where Ibn Sina also differs from Aristotle is that the assertion, the source of whose necessity is external, and B is based on perception, or which we call hiss, in a more elaborate structure involving empirical observations and deductions, which Ibn Sina calls tajruba or sequential testimony or tawatur in that sense. And assertion is the source of whole necessities, internal. It's either based on aql, intellect, or it's based on estimation or wahm. So this is the way, in that sense, apart from taking the new Platonic elements invoked by Farabi, as well as how he sees fundamentally how we can see the demonstrative scientific truths, and how the role of these assertive logical statements can be seen in that sense, and where his and aql and wahm are taken into account. So in case of Aristotle's, the posterior analytics is primarily motivated by its distinctive problems of applicability, namely the limited expressive power of its underlying logic and the insufficient extent to which certain crucial debates of theory are developed in that work. So this is the thing. So maybe Ibn Sina, the Aristotelian thing is more the applicability of these constructions that's emphasized more in that sense. So in that context, the whole the division and the hierarchy of sciences, which we also talked maybe in the lecture 2 or 3, where we talked of in the whole Muslim medieval epistemes, how could the hierarchy of sciences, whether it was Imam Ghazali or it was Saduddin Shirazi, or so also how we could place one science in relation to another science, or what is something called implication or luzum. What if metaphysics follows this follows this, mathematics follows arithmetic follows logic. In that sense, how one science is dependent upon another science, and how we can just see hierarchy of science, which science is superior or inferior to vis-a-vis other science, and in that context. There can be epistemological necessity or ontological necessity. So here the role of model analysis or propositions, where also Ibn Sina differs from Aristotle. So the point maybe of this lecture is to show the how you have to contextualize the medieval Islamic, these mantiq and other sciences from the early Greek sciences, as well as later things. So how they differ, or how they improvised, or how they improved upon some things which were not earlier present. Where you can also take the alethetic component and the temporal aspects of these syllogistic reasoning, where statements which not only categorical syllogisms were included, there were non-categorical syllogisms, which also included these statements which have modality attached to them. Where Ibn Sina is connected to a view of modality, explanation, causality, certainty, and time are all parts of one and the same complex picture. So modality, explanation, and causality and certainty, so they are all parts of the same picture. And the concepts drawn from logic and metaphysics contribute to the fabric of epistemology in essential as well as in some magical ways, in that sense, because you can also arrive at certain very surprising conclusions in that sense. So Ibn Sina's view is that every scientific proposition has a natural place in the hierarchical order of arrangement and comprehensive system of truths that reflect the structure of reality, and that it depends on the nature and status of terms. It may be appropriate for it to demonstrate in the science that it occupies, in that sense. So you can say, which I said, the role of non-categorical syllogisms is to be emphasized in that sense. And also those conditional statements which give those categorical or hypothetical or conditional or disjunctive statements which can be there. So in the whole schemata of things, the way we have those logic tables in modern times, also the way we have those logic tables, we have some statement. So how we can have affirmative statements and how we can have negative statements in that sense. So you can see these things in that context. So one important thing is that where Aristotle uses, for example, in the Aristotelian definition of cause, there are formal, material, final, and efficient causes. So here also Ibn Sina uses, he just uses remote and proximate. He also includes not only these four things, he includes these proximate and remote causes. And those causes can be subject to metaphysical, natural, or mathematical these categorizations in that sense. So the causes can be maybe remote or proximate, essential or accidental, potency in the act, proper in the common, or universal or particular causes. So this is the way how Aristotelian logic syllogism or Aristotelian logical scheme had improvisations in the Ibn Sina's, or Ibn Sina improvising upon what I should say Al-Farabi in that sense. So here we have not only conception which is called tasawwur, we also have something called tasdeeq in that sense, and we can have complete definition which is known as had hadillah, or we can have an incomplete definition which is known as hadin naqis in that sense. So the way in modern times also definition, the way we define things, definition is considered very important. How we define things, or definition is emphasized. So here also in these medieval discourses, definition is notion at the intersection of logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophical psychology. In that sense. So now this is the mid. So now we are going to a flip flop. So now we have come to from Aristotelian science, the improvised logic of medieval times. Now, if we flop it, so that we can have back and forth to how in 20th century or late 19th century we see the developments of logic, post-Kantian developments in logic or symbolic logic in that sense, and how can see contextualize this entire discourse. So in the from Kant to Carnap, if it's a trajectory which maybe Vienna Circle, we know Vienna Circle, maybe they were a group of logical positivists, maybe spanning 1925 to 35, maybe the period in which Reconstruction was written. Or prior to it, so that was the very important era. So these logical positivists were characterized by strong commitment to empiricism, a high regard for science, and conviction that modern logic is the primary tool in the analytical philosophy. So this is modern logic is primary tool in the analytical philosophy. So here I want to make a point: the logic of analytical philosophy, logic which is grounded in analytical philosophy or logical empiricism. So its epistemological foundations are different from these the way medieval these discourses somehow embedded logic in the larger scheme. So in that context, maybe Wittgenstein, Tarski, Carnap, Schiller, Popper, Reichenbach. So they don't say they are not. If you don't consider them, they are some of the counterparts. So some of the people who just invested in these disciplines, how to place logicism or logical empiricism. In that sense, how to see it. So they worked in the background of Kant's a priori notions of things, Kant's idea of a priori intuition, or his account of scientific a priori in that sense. So positivists could not accept this other a priori in logic, because Kant's a priori was in his a priori intuition was related with some conceptual concept, but and where philosophy was not aimed to discover something hidden. It was not to just other than constructing new knowledge. So here you can say the role of Bolzano, so a theologian mathematician. He says that philosophy was not metaphysics or ontology, but semantics. So the sense of purpose of foundationist or reductionist projects, such as that of reduction of mathematics to arithmetic or arithmetic. So from this departure from Kant's a priori, trying to see role of logic in semantics in that sense, it led to a development decades later in the writings of Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein, and where this Kant's modality was basically a kind of necessity which was derived from intuition and thought. So even though the traditional logicians were concerned with the problems of identifying mathematical algorithms aimed at solving traditional logic problems, means what follows from what and so on and so forth. But here, these people like Frege, their goal was to go beyond, and they talked of something formal logics. They incorporated formal logic in semantics. So where did they depart? From Aristotle, for example, Frege noted that logicians from Aristotle to Boole had seen logic as a theory of inference, in which the construction of concepts is presupposed is something that has already been completed. I start from fundamental judgments and their content, not from the concepts. So this is a departure. So from a priori taking statements in the posterior or prior analytics, how these logic they start from judgments, and then those posterior constructions become more important in that sense, and their role of linguistics becomes more important. So, for example, Bertrand Russell thought that thought was not Russell says thought was not of much help. In his opinion, logicians from Bradley to Frege had given far more importance to concept in qualification as compared to quantification of things in that sense. So here also we can see different strands going on. So trying to see maybe in logicism is trying to the way we divide whole is made of parts. We try to just see mathematical statements. Ultimately, they lead to some linguistic abstractions. And linguistic abstractions are syntactical or semantic in that sense. And the meaning is not constructed a priori in that sense. It's posteriorly taken into consideration. So that's why people like Poincare and Hilbert, they saw propositional reading as inadequate. And in that sense, you can see Carnap's syntax, Sellers' categorical syllogisms. You can see it that way. So this was a brief interlude how you saw logic in the 19th century. Now again, we are going to flip back to Ibn Hazm, so which Iqbal also quotes. He's instrumental in introducing logic in that sense. So to its adequate. So for Ibn Hazm, logic is a noble sign, an indispensable tool or ala for all science. Even though logic was logic was practiced in a very clandestine manner in the Andalusian Spain in 11th century, and maybe there was ulum al-awail and ulum al-mutaqaddimin. Even though Ibn Hazm doesn't specify who these awail and mutaqaddimin are, but somehow in a very careful way he just constructs the usefulness of logic in that sense, which the ulum al-awail, which may be comprised of logic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other science. So Arabic logic was based on Aristotelian ergonon and Porphyry's asagogy. So post-Aristotelian commentaries expanded organon and also included those Stoic and the Neoplatonic elements. Stoic elements also included empirical and non-empirical statements, which have to be later incorporated in those syllogistic statements in that sense. So they were combined into one single work with Isagogy serving as an introduction to, followed by organon in the 8 parts. So the way, if you want to translate the terms, so the categories were called makulat, hermeneutics, ibara, analytics as qiyas, apodictic statements or burhan, topics as jadal, sophistics as mughliyat, rhetoric at khataba, poetics as shir. So logic came to permeate Arab philology, theology, jurisprudence, rhetoric, dialectics. So the earlier the way I said also, there were deep-rooted attitudes which with philosophers and scientists on one side, and theologians and what I should say, jurists taking a maybe someone denigrating logic in that sense. But role of Ibn Hazm was to put Greek logic at the service of Islamic theology and jurisprudence, with his instances on thorough individual inquiry, ijtihad, and investigation for ascertaining truth. So here comes the debate whether logic can be used as a tool, it's an instrument, or it's a craft. Craft means a sinner. Logic as a science or ilm, it's a craft, sinner, or instrument, Allah. So here there can be 2-3 definitions if we just for the sake of for Ibn Sina, logic considers as a science by means of which one is able to derive knowledge from known to unknown. For Ghazali, logic is a scale by means of which one is able to discover right from the wrong. So this is a logic. Imam Ghazali emphasizes logic in some important sense. So for Ibn Hazm, logic or mantiq is the means of interpretation, ibara of all sciences. So Ibn Hazm gives a more important. So Ibn Hazm placed logic ahead of in the pursuit of religious sciences. So logic ought to be put in practice in conformity with its object, that's screening of the rest of the sciences. So maybe Ibn Hazm is more comfortable with Aristotelian syllogism over the dialectical methods of argumentations of maybe Stoics or the counter arguments of the theologians. So maybe this is a slight side comment or a digression. So interestingly, Indian logic, maybe there is something called ordinary. At ordinary level, logic is rational. At higher level, logic becomes transcendental. So in the Chettiscotti logic, there is not A and not A and not A. So in Indian school, we also have Darsanas and Nyaya school. So this is also an interesting study how this logical statement, these Indian logic can be related with. So this is a digression maybe, but I just found maybe. So in Isagogy, so this is the way logic is. In Isagogy, if it's a book of logic, there is a very interesting paragraph which I found, which may be interesting. See, Al-Mubal Ishra Ilm al-Mantiq, 10 foundations of the art of logic. So each science contains these 10 elements: the essence, its subjects and benefits, its virtue, relations and source, its name, whence it draws legal force, add topics, and all is connected with mastery, much honor is gained. So this is an emblem we can have in that sense. So here in the Muslim sense, so the way we have definitions: had, mizan, its balance, name, ism. So in the same way we normally say, the other way of saying is logic is the grammar of thought, and something Muslims introduced maybe 11th century. So it's the word something called mana. So it's not mana meaning in the English word meaning maybe in depth and breadth, but mana is a very deeper category which includes some elements of touch of divinity in it, such of touch of that an omnipresence, useful and stable world that enabled 11th century scholars to explain a great deal. So here Al-Jurjani is one of his Sughra and Kubra, these texts. Reputations as the greatest theorist of Arab politics is common. So here this is an important sentence. Greek simply helps us to see what Arab was doing. So the linguistic expression of separate category lafz. So the mana was connected with lafs, mana, and hakika, reality, truth. So these were intermeshed in a very intricate way. So this Arab poetics, the shar, the mana, the debates, so they have been very deep in that sense, where the vocal form, the mental content, and the accurate account of things, these three things, lafs, mana, and hakika, they were very instrumental, or they were the defining features for centuries. How people, for example, something called name, named, and naming, ism, musamma, and tasmiya. So there is a very interesting work written by this Alex, language of God and poets. So where it's very interestingly shown that how these debates in 11th century and 12th century, they crystallized of lafs, mana, where poets, grammarians, linguists, logicians, so exegesis, so, and maybe the background discourses of these Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites. So it's a very interesting era, and in that context, Ibn Kalam could be said that would be a science discipline or knowledge of speech, if you want to just characterize. So in the Islamic sense, how words connect to each other, which is sarf. Sarf was the science of how individual words were formed, and nazm was something bigger. So rather than the poetry breaking down into the lexical accuracy, poets instead used syntax to create images that combined lexical accuracy with imaginative predicates. For Jurjani, logic, and if you take the statement of Jurjani for logic and grammar, Jurjani was saying that grammar is a linguistic discipline, but that it is logical and its logic can be universal in that sense. So you can connect it with how this Chomsky, the universal grammar theory, in that sense, if you want to. So we have flipped from the Aristotelian logic, then to medieval logic. Then I just had some brief into how symbolic logic and logical positivists, how they saw things, post-Kantian things. Then again, I went to medievalistic logic, and now I am going to jump into text polemists of themselves, post-colonial Muslim South Asia. So this is an important text, Sulamul Ulum, which I have written here. So it's a it has been a very important text in Muslim South Asia, where the way earlier hierarchy of sciences, which I had, how they place sciences, there is something called Sulamul Ulum. There is some person called Mullah Bihari. He was a lead medieval, maybe scholar or philosopher, who had written this Sulamul Ulum, an important logic textbook in that sense, and which was translated, and there were a lot of what I should say, there were these a lot of sharah and a lot of later texts, the primary text, the secondary text, addressing the questions of the primary text. Then there are new questions arising, and those it continued maybe for 2-3 centuries and it continued even till maybe in 2012 a thesis was written. So in Muslim, in these discourses, there is something called polemicists. People discussed. The next generation of scholars come, they address some of the questions which are there in the original text, but they have some newer questions, and it's a challenge for next generation of scholars to address those questions. And then this is the tradition continues this way. So the point to emphasize is that in 1930s, 40s, 60s, and in 2012 also, a scholar in Darul Uloom Deoband, he has written a palimpsests of this text. So the tradition has continued to mention in that sense, to mention the continuity of that logical tradition. At least in the rest of in Ottomans and other places, it might be there in Safavid, but in post-colonial India, it was there. But one thing, important thing, is that the rationalist discipline in Islam succumbed to precisely the onslaught of traditionalists and literarists, to the juristic obsession of madaris, the repetition of draining curriculum, and the non-discursive epistemologies of Sufis and much else. So this can be one of the reasons why this tradition, which I was earlier saying, why it went into background. So after Ibn Sina, Ar-Razi, so there have been other people also, Taftazani, and in India there is something called Nizami Circle, which is in the Farangi Mahal. So the logic texts of 17th century denoted till space to several parts of organon, such as categories, posterior analytics, rhetoric, dialects, and politics. So maybe people did not, in the late medieval, in these texts, they do not directly refer to Ibn Sina, this Aristotle, they refer to these Isagogi, or they refer to taking specific Ibn Sina's model logic, or hypothetical syllogisms, which I said in the previous thing. So today, to say the history of it, the scholarly circles first centered in Lucknow and perpetuated by Farangi Mahalis and their students, and second in the Rampur among the Khairabadis, Mullah Hassan. So these were two camps. And maybe this text of Sulam, maybe in likelihood, may have been written in Lucknow or Delhi in that sense, in the second half of the 17th century. And in the second half of the 19th century, the commentaries of Hamdullah first began, provided in Rampur, tied to scholars in Cont, Lahore, and Aligarh. So here in these, maybe there were what was written. So there were propositions, syllogism. So in these Sulams, we had Avicenna, Farabi. We have also Sulam mentioning Razi, Ghazali, Taftazani, Mir Damad. So it had also contained not only logic and philosophy, but also rhetoric, lexicography, theology. So Sulam specifically focuses on questions of ontology, epistemology, with regards to state of mental subjects. So there was a last debate in 1916, the Rampur debate, which is considered very important. And the way invocation of this modal syllogisms, which consists of conjunctions and disjunctions. So this is the way to say this thing in that sense. So what I am trying to say is that in this context, this Sulam al-Ulum, you can also see a lot of the way modern day puzzles, the modern day this liars paradox. So there are argumentations to the effect how they address those paradox in its own vocabulary in that sense, only to show that sort of questions which late medieval logic which somehow was later maybe seen in terms of symbolic logic, or the lot of questions which are addressing those puzzles or those statements or linguistic quandaries. They are also parallelly addressed, but in some parallel episteme in these Sulamul Ulums in that sense. And particular important text of Al-Bihari, which was later improvised, or which was the way it was, the Sharh had been taken by these different people and different scholars, whether from Rampur, whether from Lucknow, whether from Delhi. So this is the thing. According to Asad K. Ahmad, he says maybe this logical thing was mostly a North Indian affair. I don't know about whether in Hyderabad also there can be the reasons, or how the way the Indian logic systems, whether it had some connection. It may be also an interesting question. Now we're coming, so which I was earlier trying to say, what I wanted to emphasize. So how we are seeing logic in the content, how we see logic in after having the definitions of logic by Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and a lot of people, which I previously discussed. The normal, our definition of logic nowadays is that the term logic traces its origin to term logos. Essentially, logic refers to judicious and objective application of reason, the outcome of which are manifested via speech and expressed through language. Logic tries to infuse modes of thinking perceived to consonance with contemporary needs and emphasizes both objectively and problem solving, and by default looks logical. So this is a modern way of looking at logic, but this way of looking at the instrumental way of looking at logic in that sense, where the logical positivists will not consider the a prioriness is somehow not that important. The posteriori, what we can observe outside in terms of empirical reality as such, and which defines the things thereof, that becomes more important as compared to it. So here, the syllogism proceeds from general to particular. So here, for example, if we use both induction and deduction, sometimes, for example, Aristotle distinguished syllogism from the induction. Induction means going from particular to general. Deduction means going from general to particular. So how is particular? Maybe once we are going to generalize, so how is particular reliable in that sense, so that it will not ultimately, because a particular can not it can vary in evidence, which may not be a particular may not be repetitive in that sense. So syllogistic reasoning, how it's different from the inductive reasoning or the deductive reasoning. So it's an interesting question. And maybe causality by induction. So this is the way we use causality in the not the causality of occasionistic, the way we see in causality by induction. Why we need to have a prior postulate to validate induction? For empiricism maintains a belief in the uniformity of nature. If two events succeed each other under certain conditions, we assume that we believe that succession to occur in the future. So this definition of induction, which is coupled to empiricism, and how can see causality in it. So how is it reliable in that sense? So empiricism as an epistemological doctrine or category claims that sensible expression in the man is the only source of human knowledge, and denies that knowledge has any other source. So this is the thing. So this is the background. So how 20th century logic, 20th century empiricism, how it developed in that sense. So in that sense, a dialect is composed of commonly accepted propositions that are judged. So in the Aristotelian way, the dialectical statements, one part of it's different from the way Ibn Sina in the dialectical statements. The one part of the statement, dialect, may be okay. Leave that's another topic. Leave it that way. So the point which I want to emphasize is that empiricism, how we can put the logicism, the analytical philosophy, and empiricism. How 20th century or 21st century, how the symbolic logic and the various disciplines, which is the mood of the current century in that sense, and where, for example, probability is needed for induction in order to explain deduction, and how maybe in Avicenna's reasoning also, when we have those modal statements, they have a statement may evolve in time, and there is also something called imkanat, mumkinat. Allah, God as a wajibul wujud. One is mumkinul wujud, imkanat, the existence of other beings, the mortal things. It's mumkin, imkan. There are many possibilities, and God has the capacity to take a given possibility into some reality in that consideration, in that sense. So so whatever I have said, so I want to make a couple of observations or a couple of things in whatever I have said. Before whatever I have given the whole trajectory or chronology to it, from Aristotelian logic, a brief how medieval logicians, and then how symbolic logic or this logical positivists or analytical philosophy, how they saw logic or logical empiricism, and maybe an branch of medieval logic, how it was also practiced in late in 19th century also, in these Farangi Mahal, Khairabadis, in particular post-colonial South Asia in that sense. So since we are reading it in the background of Iqbal, so what so before reading, so those logical disciplines in symbolic logic, so it's vary of those metaphysical issues, while in case of these modal logical systems, we have questions of time and modality lead quickly into interesting and deep metaphysical issues. So in that sense, so whatever I have said, in that sense, we are going to have a verse of Iqbal which says, जो मैं अपने आबा की किताबें देखे यूरोप में, तो मेरा दिल हो गया सिपारा. So when he went to, so maybe Iqbal was more in a Western tradition. When he went to Europe, he might have seen a lot of translated, Latinized version of those Arabic texts, and he felt that that tradition, which was a living tradition, it somehow has been monopolized by Western thinking. In that Western the global empire that was at that time, that feeling is there. But here one thing can be taken, maybe Iqbal was not the spirit of times was Iqbal is somehow trying to say, but the thing is that in the 1857 event, which may be taken as a watershed, where a lot of these people, these ulama, they were killed. So you can say the oral tradition, people went only into hifz, they went only into memorizing things. It's, for example, when a civilization is under attack, it will try to protect what is the minimal essentials. These later Farangi Mahal discourses, these Khairabadi discourses, they went into background, but it doesn't mean they did die down as a living tradition in that sense. So Iqbal's this feeling can be taken, but he may not have been aware of these Khairabadis and other people. So there can be two responses to it. so he is accepting wholesale acceptance of Western way of is accepting it, but he's not able to articulate. So what can we do? So the point is that if that tradition has been somehow taken over, or so the question is, where did these Khairabadis, where these this Farangi Mahlis, where the logic part of it, where did it differ from the symbolic logic in that sense? So to my understanding, so it's not an so it's an active if it's not an active traditions. mm, so the empiricism or logicism or the ontology of logical empiricism, which is maybe the edifice of modern AI-based language models, these data sciences. So the question is, uh, where is the problem? Why is there the disconnect? The disconnect is not primarily the reason that these sciences or these medieval discourses, they have come up to the dead end in that sense. The thing is that the epistemology of these medieval logical systems, which include these, they were in a certain epistemology which was influenced by idealism or Quran, or which was impressed upon by a certain ilmi kalam in that sense. Why it went into background is more, it's more due to not reasons which can be considered exactly in that sense. Uh, uh, that as if this modern logic and symbolic logic, as if logical empiricism has won. So the way we use Allah as wajibul wujud, as musabibul asbab, means He is the creator of all possibilities, material as well as non-material. So this thing cannot be incorporated in the way empiricism is taken as a fundamental ideology, or logical empiricism as taken into that consideration. And the way modern day computer sciences, modern day data sciences, AI based approaches, or language based models, they take inspiration, they take world fundamentally as the world, the existence of external world is a wholesome reality. There's nothing outside it in that sense. So they don't take the a priori notions of these musabibul asbab, wajibul wujud, these mumkinat, imkanat, possibilities, contingencies. The discourse, the epistemology is not that way in that sense. So Iqbal's sensibility, Iqbal's sense of loss can be somehow can somehow be ameliorated or addressed in the sense he's not. He is at least saying that we have to recognize that there was something valuable which has been overtaken by some other people. So we have. So, but the proper way would have been to engage with these medieval Islamic logical discourses, and to give its own epistemology, a certain foundation, and from which we can connect with these very modern day disciplines, mathematics, computer science, logic, linguistics, grammar. And because there's in Saraf now, there's a huge maybe literature, and it stands on its own, and in this sense, because this thing will address other questions in that sense. As Muslims, or as people in the developing world, they are merely consumers of information, technology, knowledge systems, and it creates dystopic personalities, schizophrenic personalities in that sense. We can consume best of the knowledge of Wests, but on the other hand, we can also be We don't totally divorce off our religious lineage in that sense. The disconnect is there. It produces schizophrenic personalities, not only in individuals but also in nations. I'm reminded of a famous essay by Isidore Rabi, Science and Humanities. He was saying that in Germany there were supreme uh, philosophies, theoretical philosophies, people like great philosophers were in Germany, and there were also great scientists, but they were not, the scientists were not talking to the philosophers, and that's why we created pseudosciences and pseudo humanities, and this later developments in Second World War, these Nazism and others repellent ideologies came into being. Maybe these things also, if we cannot properly connect in medieval these logic and disciplines, connect it with the modern disciplines, with their own epistemology. If we don't do it in that work is not done, we'll create people who will believe that maybe this computer science will lead to Dajjal is coming from them and something like that. These notions कि Dajjal इसका मंतज Dajjal की तरफ है या whatever. So to my understanding, we have to at least see these medieval logical model systems, post-Aristotelian, post-Ibn Sina, post all these, it has to be properly cataloged, categorized, and made some relation to the how to connect them with the modern logical systems, modern discourses in linguistics, modern computer science, mathematics, at least to make some connections, and also at least to emphasize the foundations of modern sciences, which is logical, empirical in character, in fundamental sense, and which has atheistic and other influences, which is not suitable to these these discourses in that sense. So it will be a great job, or it will be a great thing if we are able to connect these entire discourses and disciplines in a way where we cannot be mere consumers of information and knowledge in some sense, and there will be not those schizophrenic or dystopic personalities being created in that sense. So hope I have been able to connect many things in some sense, and Iqbal's sense of loss is also trying to address that thing also, from Aristotelian to medieval to modern to late medieval. All these things I have tried to connect things. Hope you might have liked today's lecture. Thanks.